History often remembers kings and queens by the crowns they wore, the wars they fought, or the legends they left behind. But hidden within the shadows of the Tudor dynasty lies a figure whose story has been overshadowed, misunderstood, and almost forgotten. She was not just the woman cast aside by Henry VIII, nor simply the mother of a queen who would one day try to turn England back to Rome. She was far more than that. She was a woman born into power, trained for greatness, and forced to survive against odds that would have broken almost anyone else. Her life was marked by triumph and tragedy, by loyalty and betrayal, and by a quiet strength that even the most ruthless of kings could never erase. She did not lead armies or hold councils, yet her influence reached far beyond her chamber walls. She shaped the destiny of her daughter, challenged the will of her husband, and stood as a symbol of faith and dignity when the world seemed determined to silence her. Imagine the courage it took to defy a king who could send anyone to the scaffold with a signature. Imagine the heartbreak of losing children again and again, and still finding the strength to stand firm. Imagine the resilience of being called dowager, discarded, and diminished, yet refusing to let history write the final line of your story. That is the woman we uncover today, the hidden jewel of Tudor history. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we will journey through the remarkable and untold story of the Princess Dowager, exploring her life, her struggles, and the legacy she left behind, one that still echoes through history. The Tudor dynasty is one of the most examined periods of English history, yet there remain stories hidden in its folds, voices that have been overshadowed by louder and more familiar names. When we think of this era, we often find ourselves circling around the figures of Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn, and Elizabeth I. Their names dominate the chronicles, novels, and dramas that have shaped the public imagination. But just beyond the light cast by these iconic personalities lies another story, one that has rarely been told in full, the story of a woman who carried the title of Princess Dowager. Her tale is less dramatic on the surface than the lives of queens who were crowned or executed, yet her role was as essential as theirs, perhaps even more enduring in ways that were subtle but deeply influential. To understand the true depth of the Tudor legacy, it is necessary to draw her out of the shadows and look at the way her presence shaped the dynasty from within. The idea of a dowager is often misinterpreted in popular thought. It conjures up an image of a widow in quiet retirement, someone removed from the front lines of political life. But in the Tudor world, titles were never empty labels. Every position carried symbolic and sometimes strategic importance. The Princess Dowager was no passive relic of a broken marriage. She embodied a legacy that reached back to Spain, a bond between two great powers, and a claim to dignity that even Henry VIII could not entirely erase. Her existence was a constant reminder that the Tudor experiment in monarchy was not only about a single man's will, but also about the webs of diplomacy, tradition, and faith that bound the kingdom to the wider world. Her arrival in England had been unexpected in its impact. Like so many young women of royal birth, she was moved across borders for reasons of alliance rather than choice. In an age when dynastic marriages were among the strongest political tools available, her betrothal was not merely a family matter, but an affair of state. She was sent to England with the weight of her parents' empire behind her. Her very presence carried a promise of unity between England and Spain, a promise that would prove both blessing and burden. At the time of her arrival, she could not have foreseen how drastically her life would shift, or how much her path would diverge from the expected script of a princess destined for glory. The years that followed her entry into the Tudor world were marked by both hope and hardship. She was initially welcomed as a bridge to continental power, her union seen as a guarantee of stability. Yet her life became entangled with a kingdom that was itself in flux, a place where the monarch's personal desires often carried more weight than the careful plans of counselors and kings abroad. When the marriage that was supposed to secure her place in England faltered and was reshaped, she found herself navigating a new identity that neither she nor her parents had imagined. It was in this transition that she became the Princess Dowager, a title meant to confine her, yet one she infused with unexpected strength. Though she lacked the open stage of queenship in her later years, her silent authority remained. She was a woman shaped by faith, and her devotion to the old church was unshakable. At a time when Henry VIII sought to tear England away from Rome and redefine what it meant to be a monarch under God, her resistance served as a moral anchor for many. She may not have wielded armies or written decrees, but she embodied an alternative vision of legitimacy. In the minds of those who clung to tradition, she was still the true queen, and her daughter was still the rightful heir. This belief endured even after official declarations stripped her of title and recognition. Her influence could not be erased from the hearts of those who saw her as the embodiment of dignity and rightful order. Her position was precarious, and her life was marked by trials that would have crushed a less determined spirit. She was moved from place to place, often in reduced circumstances, treated with a mix of suspicion and neglect. Yet even in these conditions, she maintained her sense of identity. She did not bend entirely to the pressures around her. This stubbornness was not mere pride, but a form of resistance, a declaration that the legitimacy of marriage, faith, and monarchy could not be rewritten at the whim of a single man. In this way, she became a living contradiction to Henry's narrative. Even as she was sidelined politically, her quiet endurance exposed the cracks in his authority. Her legacy was not only in what she refused to concede, but also in what she gave to her daughter. Mary Tudor grew up under the shadow of her mother's fall, yet she inherited her mother's resilience and faith. It is no coincidence that when Mary eventually rose to the throne, she clung so fiercely to Catholicism and to the vision of a kingdom bound to Rome. The seeds of that devotion were planted by the Princess Dowager, whose unwavering loyalty to her beliefs shaped her daughter's identity. Mary's reign was brief and often remembered for its turmoil, but her determination to restore the old faith came directly from the lessons of her mother's life. Thus, even in absence, the Princess Dowager's voice was carried into the very heart of English politics. It is tempting to think of influence only in terms of bold actions, public decrees, and dramatic events. But history is also shaped by persistence, by the quiet refusal to vanish, by the symbolic weight of a life lived with conviction. The Princess Dowager never staged a rebellion, never sought to overthrow the king, and never held official power after her separation. Yet her very presence unsettled the order Henry sought to impose. She was a reminder of promises broken, of a world beyond England's shores, and of a faith that could not be silenced. In a dynasty obsessed with heirs and titles, she became proof that lineage and dignity cannot be fully controlled by law alone. As we trace her story from her hopeful arrival in England to her final years of confinement, we see a portrait of endurance in the face of isolation. We also see the ways in which her life intersected with the larger currents of Tudor history. Without her, there would be no Mary I. Without her, the challenge to Henry's authority might have looked very different. Without her, the narrative of the Tudor break from Rome would have lacked its most human counterpoint. She was not simply a background figure. She was a symbol whose meaning grew larger precisely because she was denied a stage. To understand her is to understand the Tudor dynasty in a fuller sense. It is to see that history is not only shaped by those who shout the loudest, but also by those who endure in silence. Her life invites us to look beyond the familiar figures of Catherine and Anne, whose stories have been told countless times, and to consider the woman who, in her own way, carried the weight of an empire's hopes and the burdens of a king's defiance. By unveiling her hidden jewel of a story, we uncover the threads that connect personal devotion to political upheaval, private sorrow to public change, and maternal guidance to the future of a kingdom. Her journey is a reminder that sometimes the most profound influence is not written in proclamations, but in the quiet strength of a life that refuses to disappear. To understand how this woman grew into the figure who would one day stand at the heart of the Tudor story as the Princess Dowager, we must return to the beginning, to the world that shaped her before she ever set foot on English soil. Her early life was marked by privilege, but it was not the soft privilege of idle luxury. She was born into one of the most powerful dynasties Europe had ever seen, and with that inheritance came expectations, burdens, and the constant awareness that her future would never be her own. From her earliest days, she was trained not as a private daughter, but as a public symbol. She belonged to her family, but more than that, she belonged to her parents' ambitions, their dynastic vision, and the wider political stage upon which her life would be spent. Her parents were not ordinary monarchs. They were rulers of lands that stretched across continents, monarchs who believed themselves chosen to defend the faith and expand Christendom. The daughter born to them was therefore no simple child. She was a living thread in the great tapestry of European power. As a girl, she absorbed the lessons of statecraft as naturally as she did her prayers. Religion, education, and duty were woven together in her upbringing so tightly that she could never separate them. She learned Latin and theology not only for personal refinement, but because her mind, as well as her body, would serve as an instrument of her family's will. This foundation shaped the woman she became. Her childhood was marked by rigorous discipline, a seriousness of purpose that was both personal and political. While other girls of noble birth might have been raised with the expectation of marriage into regional houses, her path was always meant to reach beyond Spain. She represented an ideal that her parents were determined to export, the embodiment of Catholic devotion and dynastic pride. Even as a young girl, she understood that her destiny lay in uniting kingdoms, bridging empires, and serving as the human link between nations. It was within this context that her marriage to the Tudor heir was arranged. At first glance, the union may have seemed unlikely. England was a smaller kingdom, a rising but still modest power compared to the vast holdings of Spain. Yet the strategic value was unmistakable. For the Spanish monarchs, placing their daughter in England offered a foothold on the edge of Europe, an ally against rivals in France, and the potential for influence over an island kingdom whose naval reach might one day prove decisive. For England, the match promised prestige and connection to the wealthiest and most devoutly Catholic rulers in Europe. It was, at its heart, a marriage of calculation, a carefully crafted alliance meant to secure mutual advantage. When she set sail for England, she did so as a teenager full of expectation, but also burdened by the knowledge that she was leaving behind her homeland forever. The voyage itself symbolized the crossing of more than just seas. She was stepping into a new culture, a new language, and a court whose traditions were unfamiliar and sometimes suspicious of foreign influence. She carried with her not only her trousseau, but also the weight of her parents' hopes. To the English, she was the jewel of Spain, proof of alliance and promise of prosperity. To herself, she was both bride and emissary, tasked with ensuring the future of two dynasties. Her arrival was met with splendor, as befitted her station. The Tudor court welcomed her as a symbol of triumph, the embodiment of England's rising importance on the European stage. Yet beneath the surface of pageantry lay a tension that would never fully vanish. She was not English, and in a kingdom still defining its identity after the turbulence of civil war, the presence of a Spanish princess brought with it both fascination and unease. Courtiers praised her grace, her piety, and her refinement, yet they also watched closely for signs of difference, for hints that she might act not as an Englishwoman, but as a foreign agent of her parents' will. In these early years, she navigated her position with remarkable skill. She understood that her role was not only to be a wife, but also to be a mediator between her family's world and the English court. She softened suspicion with humility, and she reinforced her dignity with education and devotion. Her letters reveal a young woman keenly aware of the fragility of her situation, careful to balance the expectations placed upon her. She knew that any misstep might not only jeopardize her marriage, but also strain the alliance her presence was meant to uphold. The marriage that brought her to England, however, did not unfold as expected. Her husband, the Tudor heir, was young, delicate in health, and far less robust than the vigorous prince her family might have imagined as a match for their daughter. His death, which came far too soon, left her in a precarious position. Widowed before she had even secured her place, she faced an uncertain future in a foreign land. In theory, her dowry and her status should have guaranteed her safety. In practice, she became the subject of negotiation, her fate debated between courts like a pawn on a chessboard. It was in this moment that the outlines of her resilience began to show. Rather than retreating into despair, she held fast to her identity and her purpose. Her widowhood did not erase her importance, it reshaped it. She remained in England, no longer the bride of the Tudor heir, but still a symbol of the Spanish alliance. Her parents, ever strategic, sought to ensure that her position would not be wasted. The possibility of remarriage loomed, and with it, new negotiations that would once again place her at the center of dynastic calculation. Her place at the English court during these years was complex. She was both honored and isolated, respected as a princess but also watched as an outsider. The English nobility recognized her value but also debated the cost of keeping her. Her household was reduced, her resources limited, and yet she maintained her dignity with a composure that impressed even her critics. It was during this time that she learned the delicate art of survival in a court that could shift with the moods of its king and the intrigues of its courtiers. This period of waiting and uncertainty was not wasted. She cultivated allies, demonstrated her loyalty, and reinforced her image as a woman of faith and virtue. These qualities, often dismissed as passive, were in fact her greatest strength. By embodying the ideal of constancy, she became more than a bargaining chip. She became a living reminder of the promises England had made to Spain, and a figure whose presence could not easily be brushed aside. The political landscape of early Tudor England was one of transition. Henry VII had secured his throne through a combination of force and calculation, but his hold on power was not yet unquestioned. The memory of civil war lingered, and the legitimacy of his dynasty, though strengthened by victory, was still fragile. Into this uncertain world came the Spanish princess, whose marriage was intended to cement the Tudors' claim by linking them to one of Europe's most established royal houses. Her presence bolstered Henry's image, providing a sheen of international recognition that no domestic propaganda could fully achieve. As she grew into her role within this landscape, she displayed an ability to adapt without losing herself. She learned the rhythms of the English court, the nuances of its politics, and the expectations placed upon a royal woman. Yet she also carried with her the lessons of her upbringing, the sense of destiny instilled by her parents, and the unshakable conviction that her life was meant for more than decoration. She was not content to be a silent figurehead. She sought to embody the virtues that would make her indispensable, both as a wife and as a partner in the grand designs of kings. This combination of adaptability and constancy would define her journey in the years to come. Though her early life in England was marked by uncertainty and loss, it also revealed the qualities that would sustain her through the greater trials ahead. She learned how to endure disappointment without surrendering dignity, how to balance the demands of two worlds, and how to remain steady in the face of shifting power. These were not the lessons of triumph, but of resilience, and they prepared her for the role she would ultimately play in shaping the Tudor story. Her ascent into the heart of Tudor politics was therefore not the sudden rise of a young bride crowned in splendor, but the gradual establishment of a presence that could not be ignored. From the child raised in Spain with the weight of empire upon her shoulders to the widow who endured isolation in a foreign land, her path was one of endurance, adaptation, and quiet strength. By the time she would later become the Princess Dowager, stripped of official recognition but not of influence, she had already forged the resilience that allowed her to stand against the most powerful king in Europe. Her early life was not a prelude to her story, but the very foundation of it, the crucible in which her character was formed and her destiny set. If her early years in England had taught her how to endure uncertainty, her years as wife and later as Princess Dowager revealed something even more extraordinary: her ability to wield influence without the visible levers of power. Historians and dramatists often focus on those who commanded armies, wrote proclamations, or wore the crown, but the truth of Tudor politics is far more intricate. Power did not always shout, it often whispered, and in those whispers she became a master. She was never free to act as she pleased. Every choice she made was bound by expectation, by the gaze of the court, and by the ever-present shadow of the king. Yet within these confines, she found spaces where her voice could matter. Her training from childhood had given her a keen awareness that royal women, though constrained, were never powerless. They shaped culture, they mediated between factions, and they embodied ideals that could inspire loyalty. In her case, her reputation for virtue, learning, and piety gave her a kind of moral authority that was difficult for even Henry to dismiss entirely. Courtly etiquette was one of her most effective instruments. On the surface, etiquette might appear superficial, a matter of manners and rituals. But in the Tudor world, etiquette was politics in another form. The way a queen or princess received ambassadors, the tone in which she addressed nobles, even the order in which she took her place at banquets, all of these gestures carried symbolic weight. She understood this instinctively. By embodying dignity, by showing deference at one moment and quiet firmness at another, she influenced the perception of the court both at home and abroad. Foreign visitors frequently wrote of her bearing, noting the way she combined grace with gravity. To them, she was not simply the consort of Henry, but a living reflection of Spain's grandeur and the Catholic faith. Her influence also extended into the realm of correspondence. In an age when letters were more than personal messages, when they served as instruments of diplomacy and records of loyalty, she proved remarkably skilled. Surviving fragments of her letters show a woman both tender and calculating. She wrote to her father and mother in Spain, not only as a daughter but as a representative, describing the temper of the English king, the mood of the court, and the possibilities for alliance. At times, she pleaded for support or guidance, but she also demonstrated independence, offering her own judgments on the political landscape. These letters reveal a sharp mind, a woman deeply aware that her words could alter decisions made hundreds of miles away. Even when her own position at court grew more uncertain, she continued to use correspondence as a way of asserting agency. She wrote to friends, to clerics, and to allies, weaving a network of loyalty that extended beyond the immediate circle of the king's advisors. Through these connections, she kept alive not only her own dignity, but also the legitimacy of her daughter. She knew that Henry's decisions could shift with passion or policy, but she also knew that the written word had a permanence that tempers and tempests could not erase. By recording her beliefs, by appealing to principles higher than the whims of the monarch, she planted seeds of resistance that would bear fruit long after her death. Her agency is perhaps most striking when we consider the causes and individuals she championed. She was not in a position to distribute titles or command armies, but she could lend her support to those who shared her values, particularly within the church and among scholars. Her household became a haven for learning and devotion. She encouraged the education of women at a time when it was far from universal, and she fostered a culture of seriousness that left a lasting impression on those who served her. To stand in her presence was to be reminded of the ideals of piety and loyalty, and for many, this example shaped their own paths in life. In moments of crisis, she also became a voice for moderation and compassion. There are accounts of her interceding on behalf of subjects who sought mercy from the crown. Her appeals were not always heeded, but her willingness to speak for others showed that she understood the responsibilities of her position extended beyond her own survival. In doing so, she carved out a space of moral authority that even Henry could not fully control. One cannot overlook the way her influence shaped the future of the dynasty through her daughter. Though denied the recognition of queen in her later years, she never wavered in asserting that her marriage to Henry had been lawful and her daughter Mary legitimate. This stance was more than maternal pride. It was a political declaration with far-reaching consequences. By refusing to concede, she preserved Mary's claim in the eyes of many loyal subjects. Even when Henry declared otherwise, even when courtiers bent to the king's will, there remained those who believed Mary's right could not be undone. This enduring belief would prove crucial when Mary eventually ascended the throne, for her claim rested not only on the law of succession, but also on the memory of her mother's unyielding defense. Her whisper of power thus became an echo across generations. While others might have courted favor by surrendering to Henry's demands, she held firm, and in doing so, she ensured that an alternative vision of legitimacy remained alive. Her insistence on principle, though costly in her own lifetime, provided a foundation for her daughter's reign and for the broader struggle over faith and monarchy that defined the Tudor era. It is worth noting that her influence was not always visible in grand gestures. Often, it was the small acts that mattered most. A word to a courtier, a gesture of support to a scholar, a refusal to accept a title meant to diminish her. These acts, multiplied over years, created a pattern that could not be ignored. They were the quiet resistance of a woman who understood that power is not only what is granted, but also what is embodied. In hindsight, we can see that her legacy lies in this subtlety. She did not overthrow kings or dictate treaties, but she shaped the moral framework within which decisions were judged. She reminded England that monarchy was not only about force, but also about legitimacy, about fidelity to promises, and about the enduring strength of faith. Her whispers of power carried farther than shouts, and their resonance is still felt in the way we understand the Tudor story today. Her life demonstrates that influence can thrive even in apparent defeat. Stripped of titles, confined, and often isolated, she nevertheless remained a figure whose presence mattered, whose words carried weight, and whose memory endured. In an age when women's voices were often silenced, hers found ways to persist, threading through the corridors of power and into the pages of history. She was, in the truest sense, a hidden jewel of the Tudor dynasty, not glittering on the surface, but shining steadily from within, illuminating the path for those who came after her. Her subtle influence and her whispered power could not shield her from the storm that awaited her. To be a royal woman in Tudor England was to walk a perilous path. At every step, she was measured not only by her ability to please a king, but also by her usefulness to the dynasty, her fertility, and her conformity to expectations created by men who believed the fate of kingdoms lay within their command. For the Princess Dowager, these pressures were magnified by her foreign birth and by the growing ambitions of Henry, a man whose desires and insecurities would alter the course of her life in ways that even her formidable training could not have fully prepared her for. The greatest challenge she faced, and the one that would define her story in the eyes of many, was the failure to produce a surviving male heir. It is difficult for us now to grasp the sheer weight that this expectation carried. In an age when dynasties were judged by their ability to continue through sons, the absence of a male child was regarded not simply as misfortune, but as a threat to the very stability of the realm. She bore children, and she endured the grief of losing them, one after another, through miscarriages, stillbirths, or early deaths. Each loss was a personal tragedy, yet in the harsh light of the court, it was also treated as a political failure. She mourned as a mother, but she was judged as a queen. This burden was compounded by Henry's restless nature. At first, he adored her. He valued her wisdom, her devotion, and her dignity. She was a partner in the early years of his reign, when he sought to present himself as a chivalric monarch, a new Arthur, a prince of glory. Yet as the years passed, and no son lived to grow into manhood, his affection gave way to frustration, and frustration to obsession. The idea that his marriage might be cursed began to take root in his mind, and from there sprang the great scandal of his reign, his determination to set her aside. For her, this crisis was not only political but deeply personal. She had been raised to believe in the sanctity of marriage, in vows made before God that no human hand could break. To her, the idea that she was not Henry's lawful wife was not merely insulting, it was unthinkable. She resisted with every fiber of her being, not because she sought power for its own sake, but because she believed that to yield would be to deny the truth of her life and the legitimacy of her daughter. In standing firm, she placed herself in direct opposition to the king she had once served so faithfully. The scandal of the annulment battle consumed the court. Factions rose and fell around it. Clerics debated, scholars argued, and ambassadors whispered their reports back to Rome and to Spain. In the center of this storm stood the Princess Dowager, outwardly calm, inwardly unyielding. She refused to call herself anything but queen, even when Henry demanded otherwise. She refused to acknowledge Boleyn as her replacement, even when others bowed in submission. Her defiance became legendary, not the loud defiance of open rebellion, but the quiet, immovable defiance of faith. Her survival in this period is remarkable when we consider the risks. Many who opposed Henry fell swiftly and brutally. Nobles were executed, clerics imprisoned, even longtime friends discarded when they failed to bend. Yet she endured, not untouched by hardship, but alive, her dignity intact. Henry did not dare to put her to death, for he knew that to martyr her would be to inflame the loyalty she inspired among the people. Instead, he isolated her, moved her from place to place, and sought to diminish her household. She was reduced in wealth and in comfort, but never in spirit. Her ability to maintain status amidst such calculated humiliation was rooted in two qualities: her unshakable faith and her profound sense of identity. She did not see herself as a discarded wife, but as the rightful Queen of England, and she carried herself accordingly. Even when housed in drafty castles with limited attendance, she held court with the same gravity she had shown in the great halls of Westminster. Visitors who came to her presence noted that she remained regal, treating her as a queen despite the king's commands. In this way, she preserved a symbolic power that Henry could not extinguish. The scandals that swirled around her were not limited to her marriage alone. There were whispers about her household, rumors planted by her enemies to undermine her reputation. Some questioned her alliances with clerics loyal to Rome. Others accused her of encouraging resistance against the king's policies. These accusations, while rarely proven, were dangerous in an age when treason was defined at the whim of the monarch. Yet she faced them with composure, trusting that her reputation for virtue would protect her where words could not. Her resilience in the face of personal tragedy must also be remembered. Beyond the public scandals lay the private griefs that shaped her heart. The repeated loss of children was a sorrow she carried quietly, often turning to prayer for solace. The estrangement from Henry, once her partner and companion, was a wound that could never fully heal. And perhaps most painful of all was her separation from her daughter Mary, the one surviving child of their union. Henry's determination to break the bond between mother and daughter was a cruelty she bore with sorrow, but also with steadfast resistance. She refused to deny Mary's rights, and in doing so, she gave her daughter not only a claim to the throne, but also the strength of example. What makes her story extraordinary is not that she escaped suffering, but that she transformed it into endurance. While many around her fell to despair or compromise, she endured with a kind of quiet majesty. She accepted hardship without surrendering principle. She endured slander without sacrificing dignity. She bore exile within her own kingdom without yielding the truth she believed in. This is not to say that her survival was easy or without cost. The years of isolation took their toll. Her health declined, her resources dwindled, and she spent much of her later life in conditions far beneath the honor she once enjoyed. Yet even in her final years, she remained a figure of loyalty for those who opposed Henry's break with Rome. To them, she was the rightful queen, the embodiment of the faith, the living proof that kings could not simply will away the vows they had made. When we look at the volatile Tudor court, with its endless intrigues, betrayals, and shifting allegiances, her ability to maintain respect stands out all the more. Few survived long when they crossed Henry. Yet she did, not because she yielded, but because she carried herself with such unassailable dignity that to destroy her outright would have been to destroy the very image of kingship Henry sought to project. In her, the people saw the endurance of tradition, the persistence of faith, and the quiet power of a woman who refused to be erased. Her story of challenges, scandals, and survival is thus not only a tale of personal resilience, but also a lens through which we can see the broader struggles of her age. She lived in a world where power was overwhelmingly male, where queens were valued for the sons they bore and discarded when they failed. Yet she carved out a place for herself, not by overthrowing the system, but by embodying a constancy that the system could not fully contain. She survived not by denying who she was, but by insisting on it, again and again, until her very identity became a form of resistance. And so she endured, a woman of faith and dignity in a court of volatility and ambition. The storms of scandal swept around her, the pressures of politics pressed upon her, the tragedies of personal loss weighed her down, yet she remained unbroken. Her survival was not the absence of defeat, but the triumph of endurance, the quiet victory of a life lived with integrity. In this, she left a legacy that outlasted the reign of the man who sought to diminish her, and her memory became a beacon for those who believed that truth and faith could withstand even the power of a king. Her endurance through challenges and scandals, her unbending faith, and her quiet but immovable resistance against the will of one of the most powerful kings in Europe left behind a legacy that was far greater than the humiliations she endured in her lifetime. To understand her fully, we must look beyond the surface of defeat and see the ripples of her presence across the generations that followed. Though her name has too often been overshadowed by the louder dramas of Boleyn, Elizabeth, and Henry himself, her contribution was no less profound. It is only with the patience to look more closely that her lasting influence becomes clear. The first measure of her legacy can be found in the survival and eventual reign of her daughter. Without her steadfast insistence on the legitimacy of her marriage, Mary Tudor might have been erased from the line of succession entirely. It was her mother's voice, repeated through years of resistance, that kept alive the belief that Mary was born of a true queen. When Mary eventually claimed the throne, she carried with her not only her own convictions, but also the moral inheritance of her mother. The devotion to Catholicism that defined her reign, the insistence on restoring England to the old faith, the fierce belief in the sanctity of marriage and legitimacy, all of these were reflections of lessons she had absorbed from the Princess Dowager. Even those who came to despise Mary's rule could not deny that her mother's example shaped her unshakable identity. Beyond Mary, her legacy also resonated in Elizabeth, though in a different and more paradoxical way. Elizabeth was born of the woman who replaced her, yet she too grew up in the long shadow cast by the conflict between Henry and his first wife. Elizabeth's understanding of the fragility of queenship, of the dangers faced by women who tied their fortunes too closely to marriage, may have been influenced by the fate of the Princess Dowager. When Elizabeth chose never to marry, presenting herself as the Virgin Queen, she may well have drawn, consciously or unconsciously, from the memory of the wronged Spanish princess who had once been cast aside for the sake of dynastic ambition. In this sense, the endurance of the Princess Dowager shaped both of Henry's daughters, one who sought to defend her mother's Catholic legacy and one who sought to avoid repeating her mother's fate altogether. Her legacy also lies in the broader way she challenges our perception of women in Tudor history. Too often, the narrative has been dominated by images of queens as either seductresses or victims, figures whose value is measured only in their proximity to male power. The Princess Dowager defies these categories. She was neither a scheming manipulator nor a passive casualty. She was a woman who stood her ground, who claimed her dignity, and who influenced events not through theatrics, but through constancy. She showed that power could be exercised not only in coronations and proclamations, but also in quiet resistance, in the refusal to betray truth even when the cost was high. When we examine her life closely, we find that she embodied a different kind of authority, one rooted not in conquest or policy, but in principle. In a world where men wrote the laws and swung the swords, she proved that moral authority could be just as potent. Henry's determination to declare her no queen, to strip her of her titles and reduce her household, was proof of how much she unsettled him. If she had truly been powerless, he would not have needed to work so hard to erase her. The intensity of his efforts shows the depth of her influence. He could not rule without acknowledging her shadow, for she represented the vows he had broken and the truth he could not fully suppress. Her endurance also forces us to reconsider the narratives of triumph and defeat. On the surface, she seemed to lose everything: her crown, her husband's favor, her wealth, her freedom. Yet in another sense, she triumphed. She became a symbol of unbroken fidelity in an age of betrayal. She preserved her daughter's claim when all else was stripped away. She lived and died with her dignity intact, while Henry, in his restlessness, went on to discard wife after wife, his desperation for a male heir leaving a trail of wreckage. In the contrast between the two, we see that hers was the legacy of endurance, his the legacy of ruinous ambition. If we step back and look at the longer arc of history, her influence is even more striking. The very conflict she embodied, the question of legitimacy, the break with Rome, the struggle over queenship, became the defining features of the Tudor dynasty. Without her resistance, the rupture between England and the papacy might not have taken the same form. Without her defiance, the legitimacy of female succession might have been more easily erased. Without her presence, the narrative of Henry's reign would have lacked its most poignant counterpoint, the quiet queen who would not yield. Her story also reminds us that the so-called minor figures of history are rarely minor at all. Historians have long lavished attention on the glitter of Anne Boleyn's rise and fall, on the brilliance of Elizabeth, and on the brutality of Henry. Yet behind these more visible dramas lies the steady heartbeat of the woman who first gave the Tudor dynasty its international prestige, who defended its legitimacy with her very life, and who set the example of faith that resonated long after her death. If she is often remembered as a tragic figure, it is only because we have failed to see the deeper strength of her endurance. In reassessing her legacy, we are invited to think more carefully about what constitutes power. Is it the ability to command armies and draft laws? Or is it the ability to shape the moral imagination of a people, to leave behind an example that inspires loyalty across generations? If it is the latter, then her place in the Tudor story is not secondary but central. She teaches us that history is not only made by those who hold crowns firmly in their hands, but also by those who cling to principles that crowns cannot crush. Her life also challenges us to reconsider the way we speak of women in history. Too often, women are described as pawns, moved across the board by the ambitions of men. She was indeed placed in England by the will of her parents, married according to the calculations of kings, and discarded according to the desires of her husband. Yet within these confines, she refused to be a pawn. She asserted her own will, her own dignity, her own truth. She showed that even within structures designed to silence her, a woman could speak, not in shouts but in whispers, whispers that outlasted the roar of kings.